Good evening, everyone. I am Rachel Massey with Holloway Environmental and Communications, and I would like to welcome you to tonight's meeting. Tonight, the project team will be presenting information on the Lower Clear Creek and Dickinson Bayou watershed study, with a focus on Phase 3 of the study in the Lower Clear Creek watershed. As you can see on the first slide on how to participate in tonight's meeting, you can provide questions or comments throughout the meeting. As deemed appropriate by the project team, your question or comment may be addressed during the presentation, or your comment will be put into a queue to be answered in the order received at the end of this presentation. Please use the Q&A chat feature at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen to ask a question or to leave a comment that will be included in the study documentation. You may also email the project team at lccdb@leakcity.com. And as always, visit the project website at www.leakcity.com/LCCDB for more information about the study and a copy of tonight's presentation and a video recording as it is made available. Tonight's meeting will be a live presentation hosted by the project team. We look forward to all input regarding the study and this presentation tonight. With that, I will turn it over to Chuck Wolf.
Thank you, Rachel. So tonight's meeting is sort of a year plus in the making. If you remember, some of you may have attended our public meetings last year in early March, right before everything sort of happened with COVID. So we're going to focus on the Phase 3 aspects of the study, and our speakers will go into detail on those items today. The focus for tonight is actually on the Clear Creek watershed. We talked about Dickinson Bayou last night. So our agenda for this evening is we'll have a quick introduction by John Baumgartner, the city manager for League City, and then we'll go into project purpose and background, have a technical presentation. I'll touch base on the hydraulic modeling, damage assessments, some of the individual and combination mitigation solutions that have been looked at as part of the study. And then we'll talk about some of the combination mitigation conclusions, so what we've learned from those different analyses. We have a little bit of a discussion on funding partnership opportunities, what is our path forward, and then we should have time for additional questions and follow-up. So if you're using the QA feature as the speakers go through the presentation, if it's something that we can answer that's pertinent to the stuff that's being discussed right now, we'll try to answer it as we're going through the Q&A, or as we're going through the presentations. If not, we can try to adjust those at the end, or as Rachel pointed out, there are things that we can address in a follow-up after the meeting. So that's our agenda for this evening, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to John Baumgartner to give us a brief introduction.
And great. Thank you, Chuck. It's been a little bit of a journey. I appreciate everybody's patience. You said it's been a little over a year. It's probably been almost 3 years in the making between project scope development and everything, and just like to thank the public for their patience and, more importantly, their participation as we've journeyed down the creek and try to develop ways to materially influence flooding on the creek. Most importantly, all of our partners, the Army Corps, Harris County, Galveston County, Brazoria County, City of Dickinson, Friendswood, Pearland, Webster, Nassau Bay, League City, and then all the other cities within the drainage way that, if they didn't participate financially, certainly participated with technical review and input. And so again, it's important to get everybody's input. Our professional technical partners, Fries Nichols, RPS, and Holloway have been with us on the whole journey. Obviously, the general public, I think I have a couple of council members out there. I saw Larry Milliken and John Bowen and Hank Doogie. And, what I said, I think last night, the study's the easy part. The heavy lifting begins after we get a little bit further down the road. And again, appreciates everybody's participation to get us to this point. The journey's, as Chuck says, we're kind of wrapping up the study phase, but it's really the beginning of the journey, and look forward to working with everybody as the projects continue in the future. Thank you.
So we wanted to also be able to just to highlight some of the key team members. So you just heard from John Baumgartner, City Manager of League City. Our project manager for the City of League City is Anthony Toludo. As I mentioned, my name is Chuck Wolf. I'm the project director for Fries and Nichols. Brian Gettinger, who you're going to hear from quite a bit this evening, is our project manager. Jim Keith and Boris Minot have been leading a lot of the modeling and technical analysis efforts on the project. So Jim is our technical lead for the work, and Boris has been leading all the modeling efforts. And then we've had excellent support from Holloway, Rachel Massey, who helped kick off the meeting as our stakeholder lead, and then Greg Sevchik is our meeting facilitator. And as it relates to Clear Creek, we've had great support from other consultants working on other projects with other agencies that are connected to this waterway, because there's a lot of focus on it. So Natalie Cheney and Louis Perdita with RPS, who are working on the Galveston County Master Drainage Plan. Lonnie Anderson, who's been doing work with Harris County Flood Control District with Pape Dawson Engineers. And then LJA, Georgina Aurelio, and John Grounds, who've been working with the city of League City on some of the localized drainage improvement work. So we thank all of their efforts helping us get to this point, because we've sort of used something from everybody in these solutions and these analysis set. And certainly as we move forward in time, we'll hopefully continue to be partnering with them too. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our project manager, Brian Gettinger, to sort of kick off the technical part of the presentation. Brian?
Thanks, Chuck. Appreciate you setting the stage, and then thank you, John, for your support and getting this project effort taken forward. As Chuck noted, there's a lot that has transpired in the watershed since Hurricane Harvey. So all these products are working together. In some ways, a little bit different focuses. We have the upstream section of Clear Creek. Tonight, we're going to talk about the lower section of Clear Creek. Lower section of Clear Creek starts at FM 1959, the Galveston County line, and goes out to Clear Lake and to Galveston Bay. The upper section of Clear Creek is from 288 to FM 1959. So that's a section that the Army Corps and Harris County are working on, a federal project in that section. So we've been coordinating with those groups. We also are coordinating with LJA, as Chuck mentioned, on the League City Master Drainage Plan, and also on the Galveston County side, the mainland flood study that RPS is working on. In addition to this, we've had a lot of coordination with other stakeholder groups, City of Friendswood and others, about local projects they've got going on. The good news is there's a lot of things happening. And then on top of that, we now have the Texas Coastal Study looking at surge risk, possibly a gate structure on Clear Lake. A lot of things happening, which is great. Keeping everything coordinated is important, and we've done a pretty good job of that so far. And a lot of the prospects that we talk about tonight are a combination of efforts by multiple folks. So appreciate everyone's support in the project so far. Okay, we're going to talk a lot tonight about where we're at, but I want to make sure for folks that maybe couldn't attend previous meetings, they understand how we got here. So we're spending a few minutes talking about the project background. We'll start with the purpose. So the purpose of this project is to develop a comprehensive flood mitigation plan for Lower Clear Creek and Dickinson Bayou's watersheds, including identification of vulnerabilities in the watersheds and development and refinement of the concepts to reduce flooding. So Dickinson Bayou, as Chuck mentioned, was last night. That presentation, it will be made available on the League City website. The slides will be made available on the League City website, so you guys can peruse that on your own. Tonight, we're going to focus on Clear Creek. The purpose is really those watersheds. We're looking at riverine impacts. We're looking at mitigating major storm events in the watersheds. Storm events like Harvey and very large storms that cause catastrophic damages. How can we have these watersheds perform better and reduce flooding when those big storms that we know are going to happen again in the future come? So folks on the phone are probably living in or near the area, are pretty familiar with the Clear Creek watershed, pretty familiar with Dickinson Bayou watershed. I mentioned the delineation at the Galveston County line at FM 1959. So we're focused on this section as shaded here in red tonight, which is the lower section of Clear Creek, kind of the Friendswood, Webster, League City section. Clear Creek has been looked at for a lot of years. It's measured in decades. And so we, as John noted, we are beginning, not ending the phase, but beginning the real work of getting this work done. So tonight we'll be talking about this section in red. A little more on the focus. I mentioned, and you're going to hear this a lot tonight, this is a riverine regional magnitude study. So that means that when we show damages, those damages are along the creeks. They are maybe not as significant as what actually happened during Hurricane Harvey. So you might see one of our inundation maps and say, hey, well, I flooded during Harvey. My house isn't shown as flooded on this map. That's because people that were further away from the channel may have flooded because of backed up storm sewers and things. But one of the next steps we'll talk about toward the end is how we tie in those local analyses into this to make it a more robust effort. We are looking at Atlas 14 rainfall intensities. That's the newest rainfall data that's available. We're looking at a 24-hour storm duration. The flood risk analysis is going to show flooding along the creek, but damages and flooding instances are going to be higher than we talk about tonight. Now, we're showing some very high damages and flooding instances, but in reality, they're even higher. And that's evidence from people's personal experiences. It's evidence from information we've got from the city of Friendswood and City of League City about what homes flooded, where they did rescues during Harvey. And so that's something we can tie into this now that we have the base model for the creek. The creek governs everything. And now that we have it, we can look at how those local storm sewers work. So we are looking at a 2, 5, 10, 50, 100, and 500-year storm event. The 500-year storm event is actually larger intensity than Hurricane Harvey. So Hurricane Harvey, based on the new Atlas 14 rainfall data, is about 125, 150-year storm event. So we did model Harvey, and we are looking at all those different storm intensities as well. In order to break the project up and make sure we were identifying solutions and kind of throughout the watershed, we divided Clear Creek into 3 different reaches. So Reach 1 is essentially the section that we'll call Friendswood, the upper section, which goes from FM 1959 to Bay Area Boulevard, that's shown here in red. Reach 2 is sort of the transitional section that goes between the upland area and then down into Clear Lake. So we've got, it crosses I-45, crosses State Highway 3 in this reach. It's shown in green. So it's Bay Area Boulevard to FM 270. And then in purple, we have, it really is the Clear Lake section, which is FM 270 out to the outlet of Clear Lake into Galveston Bay. So when we talk about reaches tonight, and we show data in different reaches, Reach 1, think Friendswood. Reach 2, think I-45. And Reach 3, think Clear Lake. So why are we here tonight? What's our purpose? The study is not done. It is getting close to being done, but we're here tonight to tell you what we found and allow the public a chance to weigh in on that before we finalize our final reports. So we have this slide deck, we have this material, we have a lot of analyses to present tonight, but we haven't read the final report yet. We want to make sure we had a chance for the public to weigh in on what we're presenting, get input again from the stakeholders, and make sure that what we're presenting is what makes sense and what the public wants and needs to mitigate flooding. Doing this whole project through COVID was challenging. We were able to sneak the first public meeting in person, so I appreciate the chance to meet a lot of you there. Online is different. I'd much rather be doing this in person with you guys, talking face to face. But we do have the opportunity to record this, and we can post it online. So I think we are getting pretty good feedback and information dissemination, which is good. So tonight's about sharing results. We do want your feedback. We do want your questions. So as you have questions during the meeting, please throw those in the Q&A, and we will address those either sometimes real time for whoever's not speaking, and other folks can, if we don't get to it, we'll get to it at the end after we're done with the presentation. All right, so timeline. We are at the end, right? We're at March 2021. Initially, the project was scheduled to get done in May 2021, but we know every month counts, and we're looking at hurricane season starting again pretty soon. So we bumped this up a couple months to try to be as succinct as we could with the study. A lot of things went into this. There's a lot of analysis done. We built a tool that can be used by the cities and stakeholders to evaluate flooding and changes to the watershed in the future. And again, this is our last chance for widespread input on the project, and so we encourage you guys to be vocal and to support that by using the Q&A feature. So to kind of dig into the details a little bit, I am going to introduce Jim Keith. He's our technical lead, an H&H expert. He's been working on the project since even before we started getting it set up. So Jim will take us away and talk about some of the flood risk and the analysis that we did to deliver our results.
All right, thank you, Brian. So we're going to talk through some of these flood risk analysis results because that really drives a lot of the conversation on mitigation alternatives that Brian's going to talk to later. So one of the first things we did as we completed the flood risk modeling analysis was to look at damage centers. And when we talk about damage, that's really a function of flood depth that's expected and then the value of those properties that are flooded. And so you can kind of see here in this map, there's 4 major areas that were real hot spots where a lot of damage is to be expected. And as we talk about mitigation alternatives, you'll see we're really focused on providing the most benefit in these areas to reduce the damage. One thing that we assume, because we don't have exact finished floor elevations everywhere, we assume that slab elevations for most homes were 6 inches above natural ground. There are some areas where we had some better information, but that's kind of a broad assumption as we start to look at flood depth in structures. You can go to the next slide, Brian. So this table here shows the 100-year peak discharges. It's a comparison from the FEMA effective study, the older studies that have been done before, and then our new analysis for both existing and future conditions. And so our new analysis was based on Atlas 14 rainfall data. That's the newest rainfall data that NOAA has published. And if you've been following any of that discussion, you know that there were big changes in Southeast Texas for the expected rainfall amounts. And that made quite a difference. You can see that the outflow rate at the outlet increased by 87 or 84% just with the new rainfall data for existing conditions. And we present these numbers in cubic feet per second, CFS. So to kind of help you understand and visualize what's a cubic feet per second, that's about the same as a basketball full of water passing every second. And so you can see the amount of water we're talking about here is significant. You got at I-45, 35,000 basketballs a second moving past. By the time you get to the Clear Lake outlet, you're over 86,000 basketballs per second. So we're dealing with significant volumes and flow rates on Clear Creek. The other thing that we looked at is future conditions. So we looked at projected land use 50 years into the future. Now, obviously, much of Clear Creek is already developed, so there's not a lot of changes that we saw here. There's a little bit of increase near FM 1959, but for the most part, we don't anticipate a lot of changes in terms of future runoff conditions. So again, for damages, we try to kind of bracket the problem here. Obviously, we're focused on large-scale storm events, similar to Harvey and other events that you guys have experienced there. So we want to make sure that we have flood solutions that can address the damage expected from a 500-year storm. And we also look down as low as a 5-year storm, which is very frequent, but there's still some flood damages that can happen there. It's difficult below that point if you have structures that are flooded in a 5-year storm to really design and implement flood mitigation projects that reduce that risk. They're just so low in the floodplain that it's hard to reduce that. So we focused our mitigation analysis in this bracket that we call the area of benefit. And these are really the damages that we are trying to mitigate. You can see between that $920 million number in a 500-year storm and 8,500 structures, we've got a lot of work to do. So we focused on trying to get rid of that $908 million problem between the 500-year and the 5-year event. This next slide, you guys probably have been familiar kind of looking from the top down at floodplains, especially if you've seen some of the previous material that we presented in public meetings. This is a little different way to look at it. And so what you're seeing here is a side profile view of Clear Creek. And you start on the left at the downstream end, you can see State Highway 146. It's called out there. And as you move to the right, you're moving upstream through Clear Creek, up through I-45, Bay Area Boulevard, all the way up to FM 1959, which is the upper end of our study area. And the lines that you see here, the red line is the 5-year future conditions flood profile. The blue line is the 100-year elevation, and the purple line is the 500-year flood elevation. And all of these little X's, there's so many in here you can hardly tell they're X's, are structures. We looked at structures kind of about a 5,000-foot swath along the channel and looked at the structures in terms of their elevation. It really gives you a picture not only for the sheer number of structures that are flooded, but the depth to which many of those structures are flooded. You see for the 100-year event, many of those structures are significantly underwater. And again, as I mentioned earlier, that's what really drives the damages. So the goal of the projects here, again, are to reduce the water surface elevations for these 100-year and 500-year events to prevent these structures from flooding. So to summarize, kind of just on the pure flood risk assessment of structures, we looked between these three planning area or reaches. We looked at individual storm events. You can see in this table here, we looked at a 500-year event, 100-year event, 50-year event, 10-year event. But what is really informative and what helps us quantify both costs and benefits is to look at the estimated instances of structural flooding over a 50-year period. So if you look at the statistical projection of these different storm events from frequent 2-year, 5-year, 10-year events up through the 100-year and 500-year storms, if you look at all of those storms over a 50-year period, you can see that for the Clear Creek study area, we have over 10,000 instances of flooding that we would expect over that 50-year period. And the damage, just based on current property values, is $365 million. And we know over the past 20 years, the actual frequency and intensity of these storms can vary greatly. Slide, please. The other flood risk, and a couple of things we'll talk through here. So the previous slides are really focused just on the riverine flooding aspect, but the other risk that's here in the lower end of Clear Creek is really sea level rise. And the Corps of Engineers provided support for us on this project, developing sea level rise projections and also storm surge frequency projections. And so for our study, we assumed in the future a water surface elevation of about 6 feet for all events greater than the 10-year event. And this accounts for both a 5-year, assuming kind of a 5-year storm surge stage, so higher than just high tide or normal high tide, assuming some kind of storage, slight storm surge coming from the event, as well as the mid-level sea level change that's been produced or projected by the Corps. So you can see that any structure, there's a lot of structure in this red inundation mapping shows you that elevation, and there's 225 structures, give or take, worth almost $90 million that are at risk just from that sea level rise assumption. And the other thing is it really reduces our ability to kind of get water out and reduce that water surface elevation downstream of FM 270. So this is kind of another one of the challenges in terms of flood mitigation, as well as just another flood risk that we felt was important to communicate as part of this study. The next things that we looked at are transportation system impacts. So along with just structural flooding, when flooding happens, it impacts our ability to get around. It impacts your ability to go pick up your kids from school, get to and from work. It impacts emergency responders. And so we used the United States Bureau of Reclamation has a flood hazard calculation that uses both the depth of overtopping of a roadway as well as the speed that water is moving to estimate what they call a damage classification or a danger classification. And they kind of have a low danger, a medium judgment zone, and then a high danger zone. So as you look at this map, the main thing to point out here is that red triangles are bad. Those are areas that are expected to flood at 5-year or less storm event with a high danger classification. The green circles are kind of low danger zone, even up for the 100-year. So really the major crossing of greatest risk that we identified was Whispering Pines Avenue that's impacted in a 10 to 50-year storm event. And then finally, we looked at critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure are water supply infrastructure, emergency services, schools, hospital. And so this graphic here shows you the 100-year flood elevation. And you can see there's significant amount of water infrastructure. That's the little water drop symbols that you see there. That's inundated in a 100-year event, as well as we've got, I'm probably going to say the name wrong, but LaVaugh Stewart Elementary School, which is near SH 146 and Marina Bay Drive. So again, a lot of the other flood risk results that we wanted to communicate as part of the study and make sure that everyone understands the impacts that kind of propagate out from flood events for critical infrastructure. So finally, just to summarize in terms of damage, future instances of flooding and future damage amounts in dollars. You can see that Reach 1 through Fringewood has got pretty limited damage up to about the 10-year event. But once you get beyond that, the water starts getting out of the bank, you start to see increasing orders of magnitude in terms of both damage and instances of flooding. And there's significant damage exceeding $1 billion and 4,800 structures for a 500-year event. Reach 2 has got a little bit less development than Reach 1 and 3, so there's fewer structures, but you kind of see a similar pattern there, where the damages really start to escalate beyond the 10-year event. And then Reach 3 has kind of less favorable performance relative to the 10-year event, and again, that's kind of due to what we talked about a minute ago on the sea level rise and the downstream water surface controlled by Galveston Bay. So again, as we mentioned earlier, this structural flooding is from riverine flooding, and so there's some other impacts from local flooding and local drainage that's not really accounted for here, but we anticipate that something could be looked at in future phases. I think with that, I'll pass it back to Brian to start getting into the mitigation alternatives.
Thanks, Jim. Appreciate you setting the stage for us to talk through the alternatives here. So it can rain really hard. We did look at a lot of different storm events. The question now is, how do we evaluate those alternatives that we're looking at? And we talked through some of these at previous meetings, some of the concepts. We're going to present a lot of data in the next slides. For everyone's sake, the slide deck will be available for everybody to review later. So we're going to go through this pretty quick. We don't talk through individual alternatives tonight. We talk through in detail the combination alternatives, and I'll spend time on each of the individual components of those alternatives. But the final report, when it's published, will go through kind of each individual alternative and show how it performs individually. But tonight we're going to focus on the combinations. But first, let's talk about how we're going to evaluate them. So we're going to look at quantitative and qualitative evaluation criteria. So number one, how often is something flooding? And if we have an improvement, how much less often will things flood? So that's instances of flooding. Look at that over a 50-year period. And that's a statistical analysis that looks at the 2, 5, 10, 50, 100, and 500-year storm. Looks at that, how often it's going to happen in a 50-year period, and gives us that analysis. That's a kind of a standard practice that's established for a benefit-cost ratio based analysis. Same thing applies to structural damage. The monetary value of those structures is based on the depth of damage, or sorry, depth of water in the home. That's a Army Corps of Engineer standardized procedure based on the total value and the depth. Same 50-year analysis. We're going to look at the capital cost to construct these, and as a kind of a high-level concept study, the capital cost doesn't have a lot of significant figures, but it is order of magnitude correct for these different alternatives. And finally, Jim mentioned the transportation system impacts. We are looking at that. How many times are the culverts over the bank? How many bridges are washed out? How many people can't get from point A to point B because maybe the bridge itself isn't washed out, but the approaches are, so you can't get over the bridge. We're going to keep track of that as well. Qualitative metrics. This is a slide that we developed with the stakeholder groups to try to identify what projects have merit, maybe not just based on cost, but how fast they could be implemented, how obtrusive will land acquisition be, how it's going to affect the community, how operationally resilient, and how much maintenance would it take to operate it, and how much coordination is required. So obviously, we want projects that have great benefits, right? Instances of flooding go way down, damages go way down, and cost is as inexpensive as possible. But we also want projects that we can implement. Clear Creek has a long history of projects that have been proposed that never got implemented, so we want to find things that we can implement here. So with that, I think we need to start the discussion on where Clear Creek has been over really the last 50-plus years. So this is a slide that is taken from the 1982 Army Corps of Engineer Pre-Construction Authorization Planning Report, which showed at the time the intent to channelize Clear Creek from about where 288 is now out to Clear Lake and then out to Galveston Bay with the new outlet structure. The only product that was constructed from this was the new outlet structure on Clear Lake, which has a substantial benefit of removing water out of the lake. The rest of it didn't get constructed. There was substantial environmental concern, there's substantial community impact concerns, particularly in the section that we're now calling Lower Clear Creek from FM 1959 out to Galveston Bay. Obviously, now the upper section from 288 to 1959 is in the planning process and moving hopefully soon to construction. But there's been a lot of things discussed, and a lot of the concerns that came up in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s have informed our analysis Obviously, things have changed since Harvey. Perspective has changed since Harvey. But we focused on trying to analyze things that have a high likelihood of being able to be accepted by the community and then implemented to avoid this sitting another 30 or 40 years before something happens. So with that, let's talk through kind of some of our constraints. Informed from the previous efforts, these are our 4 constraints that we applied to our concept analysis as kind of guide rails. So we were not going to widen the channel on Clear Creek downstream of Bay Area Boulevard. There's significant environmental concerns. Once you get past Bay Area Boulevard, it becomes tidally influenced very quickly. There's a lot of mud flats and very shallow areas. I know from personal experience from getting my boat stuck in a couple of them, actually twice on the same day one time. It is an environmentally sensitive area. Widening the channel there, although maybe possible, would be environmentally difficult to permit, and there'd be significant pushback to doing so. So we are not going to widen the channel downstream of Bay Area Boulevard. We're not going to build a new bypass channel that creates an open cut crossing of I-45. I-45 is a major transportation corridor. Doing so would disrupt transportation for millions of people, and not seen as something that is a good idea. We're not going to have any additional conveyance to Clear Lake, so we're not going to get water to Clear Lake faster without helping get water out of Clear Lake faster. So we don't want to create a benefit upstream of Clear Lake and have a negative impact in Clear Lake. It just moves the problem downstream. We got to get the water all the way to Galveston Bay. We also are not going to do clearing and desnagging downstream of Bay Area Boulevard for the same reason we're not going to have the widening in that section because of environmental concerns. We actually did look at this one after some urging from some of our stakeholders to make sure that we weren't missing something there. And in fact, that the snagging at that section doesn't have a great benefit anyway. But that is kind of our 4th boundary. So lots of concepts were developed, but these were our 4 things that we were not going to do. So what did we look at? The answer is a lot. So we had 17 large-scale structural improvements that were evaluated for Clear Creek. This is the individual concepts list. So as I stated, when the final report comes out, it will have information about how each one of these performed on an individual basis. And then we're going to talk tonight about how they performed on a collective basis. So we have detention improvements, we have bypass channels, we have channel improvements, we have tunnels, we have bridge replacements. All of those things individually provide some benefit. Sometimes they provide benefit and consequences. And so when we did our combination analysis, we looked at things, if something was causing a consequence, how could we mitigate the consequence with another benefit solution? So lots of things evaluated. It was kind of an exciting analysis to try to pair these up and create combination solutions that were most effective. So Jim showed this figure earlier. This is the damage map, or so the elevation map of all the different structures. Clear Creek performs pretty well. Folks that attended last night on Dickinson Bayou, so there's a lot of structures along Dickinson that fall within this 5-year water source elevation. Clear Creek, for the most part, doesn't. And you saw that on some of the bar charts earlier, that in the 5- and 10-year storm events, most structures on Clear Creek are well protected, and that's great. It's great news. There are still some that are in this 5-year risk area. Those structures are so far into the floodplain that even if we throw very large concepts into the solution set, it's impossible in some cases to pull the water source elevation down far enough to get that property out of the floodplain. So those properties are good candidates for elevation, good candidates for voluntary buyouts. We don't identify those individually tonight or in this phase, but if you have a property that's flooding on a 5-year basis, it needs another solution than a major structural improvement on the channel. So when I talk about 2 concepts that you're not going to see in the combination analysis, not necessarily because they're not a good concept, but because it wasn't part of the core modeling effort. One of those is a flap gate for the Shore Acres area. So Shore Acres had a lot of flooding during Hurricane Harvey. You can see in the upper right-hand corner an inundation map. It's got a lot of hot colors on it. Hot colors mean deep water. So Freeze Nichols did a study, separate study actually for Harris County Flood Control that got finished in September of 2020. That study effort produced this chart you guys see on the lower left side of the screen here. And you can see that the yellow lines here is the Clear Lake elevation at Highway 146 and Kemaw. And the red and green lines are the elevation in Shore Acres and Taylor Lake. So it's pretty clear that the elevation in Taylor Lake and Shore Acres pretty closely follows what's happening in Clear Lake, right? The backwater effect is a significant factor. That backwater effect, combined with some local drainage system improvements that are needed, resulted in a lot of flooding. So one solution would be to cut that backwater off, essentially creating a flap gate system that would prevent tidal flows over a certain elevation from getting back into shore acres. Right there, kind of at 146, the channel next down. So that's a solution that we did not model as part of our solution analysis, but one that we think should be further investigated because we have a substantial benefit for a relatively low-cost capital improvement. Another thing we looked at, but is not included in the recommendation, is what we'll call a mega-detention pond. So there's always the discussion about what's better for flood mitigation. Should you build detention or should you build conveyance? We wanted to test out the detention hypothesis and see, well, how big of a detention pond would you have to build? So in order to reduce the flow rate at I-45 by 5,000 CFS, you need a 3,000 acre-foot storage basin. In order to reduce the flow rate by 10,000 CFS, you need a 10,000 acre-foot storage pond. Well, what's 10,000 acre-feet? Well, 10,000 acre-feet is about the same size as Clear Lake. Clear Lake's about 1,700 acres. So it's 6 feet deep, 10,000 acre-feet. So it would be a gigantic water body. Based on the development of Clear Creek, this, and because detention needs to be in the upper portion of a watershed, this would have to be located somewhere in Friendswood. And it's unrealistic to site something this big in the watershed as it's currently developed. It's going to cost at least $500 million, probably just for all the dirt moving. That doesn't include property and permitting. Major property acquisition results in loss of tax revenue. And also, the big concern, and this comes up when we talk about Hurricane Harvey and Tropical Storm Allison, what happens when it rains for 3 days? Our analysis for this study was based on a 24-hour storm duration, storm intensity, which the 24-hour intensity was much higher than Harvey, but Harvey happened for 3 days, right? So Harvey was a very large storm because it lasted for 3 days. Well, detention ponds work great for the first storm or first day, but on the second and third day, they're full. Right? So you could build this big pond, and if you have a multi-day storm, it gets full. It takes a long time to drain, and doesn't provide much benefit. So this is not something that we recommended for kind of further analysis, was the mega detention ponds. We talked about what happened in the 1980s and 90s and 2000s about what was the biggest problems with conveyance improvements. It was a major channelization improvement of Clear Creek, particularly the areas south of 1959, but really from Bay Area Boulevard to Clear Lake. That section was very problematic on an environmental perspective. So we thought about how can we move this water without causing those problems. One of the solutions we looked at is tunneling. So tunnels can move a lot of water. They can be built in very large diameter. We don't have a lot of differential head at this low section of the watershed, but there is enough to move water. So this would function as an inverted siphon. We looked at 5 different intake locations. One at 1959, one at 2351, one at 528, one at Bay Area Boulevard, and one at I-45. We did 3 different diameters, 30-foot diameter, 40-foot diameter, and 50-foot diameter. These are all flowing entirely by gravity as part of our analysis. All of these discharge to Clear Lake except the I-45 tunnel, which discharges directly to Galveston Bay. And even that do discharge to Clear Lake assume that hydraulic improvements made to Clear Lake to get that water out to Galveston Bay faster. So what do those different alignments look like? Well, if built, the alignment looks like nothing because there's an intake structure and an outlet structure, but along the way there is no disturbance. But we had 5 different alignments. Like I said, there's 4 of those that discharge to Clear Lake near the NASA facility, Johnson Space Center, and then 1 that discharges following FM 518 at Galveston Bay. We ran a lot of simulations on these, looking at different upstream and downstream conditions, looking at different sizes. What we found is that the 2 tunnels that were the most effective were the ones shown here in blue and red, which is the FM 2351 tunnel and the I-45 tunnel. So those 2 you're going to see later in some of the combination analyses. These tunnels can be built following public right-of-way, and the reason a lot of these routes exist is they're following public right-of-way. They can make 1,000-foot radius curved turns, and this inverted siphon concept has been proven out in other places. So the Waller Creek Tunnel in Austin exists, the San Antonio River Tunnel exists, which protects the Riverwalk in San Antonio, and they're building a 35-foot diameter tunnel in Dallas right now for the same purpose. So the big benefit here is we don't have the channel improvement happening at the surface, so there's no environmental impacts. The intake and outlet structures can be developed in a way that they really blend in, or in some ways almost imperceptible to the public, or it could be curated as an amenity. So they're doing kind of both of those things in Austin with the Waller Creek Tunnel. It presents a lot of opportunities to move water and not have all the challenges you have with the surface. So we'll talk a little bit more about those as we get in to the analysis further. So the other thing we are talking about, I want to spend a minute on as an individual basis, is the Clear Lake outlet expansion. So the Clear Lake outlet's a complicated hydraulic structure. You've got the essentially the boat channel, sailboat channel out through Kemaw, which is ungated, right, an open channel. You also have the gated second outlet structure, which was constructed as part of the federal project. It was recommended in the 1980s. So we've got two different ways to get the water out. You also have actually a channel that runs from north to south, connects the two things. So it is a complicated hydraulic structure there at Highway 146. What we did see during Hurricane Harvey is that there was a higher elevation in the lake than there was in Galveston Bay, which seems to say that, hey, is there an opportunity here we could get more water out faster? A lot of ways to do that. It's a complicated structure, and one that we were not set up to model in great detail in our analysis, but we did notice something that we think should be investigated further, in part because we're showing an 84% increase in the flow rate because of the Atlas 14 rainfall data. So the structure was designed, the outlet was designed as a collective system here for a certain flow rate, and now we're seeing a lot more water because of things like Hurricane Harvey and the new rainfall data. Something that an expansion of this outlet system is something that we think should be investigated more in the future. All right, so individual mitigation effectiveness. We looked at a lot of different things. In this table there's a lot of data here, something you guys can dive into as you get the slide deck, and again, it'll be reported in the report as well. But we have different alternatives, and the more green something is, the better it performed. The more red something is, the more problems it caused. So things that had red things, so we have clearing and desnagging, has a good benefit, right? It eliminates structures, but it also moves water faster downstream, right? So it causes flooding. So when we have something like that, we've got to pair that solution with something else. Channel benching, same thing. Channel improvement, same thing. Remove structures, which is great, but it causes structures to flood downstream. So we can't have that. So we got to find a way to pair it. The tunnels remove a lot of structures, remove a lot of damage. They also cost a lot of money. So there's all these things that have to be weighed together. So we have these kind of rated as most efficient for flood, most efficient per dollar for improvements. But again, this is based on just the 100-year analysis. So as we go into combinations, we're also going to look at the whole 50-year statistical formula as well. So what did we find from looking at all these different concepts individually? Number one, we can't make improvements upstream at Clear Lake without additional outlet capacity into Galveston Bay. We ran a lot of model simulations, and whenever we got water Clear Lake faster, we were showing impacts in Clear Lake that were not, the water was going up there instead of going down. We got to find a way to get the water all the way to Galveston Bay. Detention improvements. Detention is good, right? It does help, but multi-day storms fill the basins up, and you can't get that water downstream. You have to get it out of the system, right? If we just store all the water in the system and all the detention basins get full at the same time, then we have a problem, right? So we need, detention helps, but it's not by itself a solution. Conveyance improvements in Friendswood really help Friendswood, but we have to be careful because some of them are causing downstream impacts nearly as large or larger than the benefit they're providing. So we need to pair those conveyance improvements in Reach 1 with conveyance or storage improvements in Reach 2 and 3. We've got environmental challenges along between Bay Area Boulevard and FM 270 that we talked about. It limits the ability to build that conveyance you need there at the surface or build any additional storage. Tunnels can move a lot of water. They can provide protection against very large storm events. You can even supplement them with pump stations and other things to increase their capacities, but they're very expensive, right? And they are something that's not commonly operated in this area. So it'd be something kind of new. So the overarching conclusions are, to get the best bang for our buck, we need a combination solution that's going to maximize the benefits. And we also need to look at the full benefit of mitigation. It takes into account the local drainage system benefits as well as the riverine benefits, particularly because the tunnels have the ability to move flow underneath cities. So for example, the I-45 tunnel follows underneath FM 518 through League City. The Friendswood tunnel follows through Friendswood and Webster and Houston as it goes out to Johnson Space Center area. if there's ponding or flooding happening because of storm sewer backups there, those could also be dropped into the tunnel. And so there's an opportunity for significant local drainage benefits for some of these solutions that are not calculated. So when we see benefit numbers and structures of instances changed here, that's not accounted for. That's something that we need to account for in the future. All right, so I think I've set everyone up long enough that let's talk about the combination solutions. That's what everyone's here today to hear about. So what are we going to look at for our combination solutions? We have 3 different scenarios. One of them is called conveyance improvements. This is the least expensive of the 3. It includes 2 large detention basins at the upstream end of Reach 1. It includes clearing and desnagging, which I'll talk a little more in a second. It includes taking out the Highway 3 and the Union Pacific Railroad track bridge and replacing them with a bridge that's more hydraulically efficient. It includes a bypass of FM 270. It includes potential for voluntary buyouts. And it includes an improvement to the outlet structures at Clear Lake. The Kemah Channel and the other structure, how do we get it? How can we increase conveyance out of the lake to prevent impacts? That's our lowest cost solution. It's in purple. The next one is we looked at, okay, let's do that. And how much better can we make the benefits if we add a tunnel to it? So if we add the FM 2051 tunnel, which goes from Clear Creek and FM 2051 down to Clear Lake at 40 foot in diameter. And the third solution is, okay, let's take those conveyance improvements. Instead of the 2051 tunnel, let's put the tunnel in at I-45. This tunnel doesn't provide as much benefit in the upstream section. So in addition to that, we're also going to bench the channel above the ordinary high water mark from 1959 all the way to Bay Area Boulevard. And because this tunnel does not discharge to Clear Lake, we don't need to build any sort of expansion in the lake. Expansion of the lake could still be built and would provide additional benefit, but it's not necessary because the tunnel is not discharging there. It's diverting a lot of water away from the lake. Let's talk about each one of these individually. So here's our, what we call a raster map. So this, what you see in colors here is looking at the comparison between the future condition with no projects and the future condition with projects. So the bluer a color gets, darker the blue and all the way to purple, implies greater benefit. But you see the detention basins, which are the Friendswood Basin and the Timber Creek Basin, in red. That's red because there's a lot of water ponding there. That's good. We want the water to pond there. That's okay. It's red inside those lines. But we also see that, the darker the blue, the better. So this real light blue that you're seeing in Clear Lake, that's about 1/2 inch to an inch of water source elevation reduction. As the blues get darker, we go from 1 inch to 6 inches. The darker blue is 1 foot to 2 foot of difference, and then the darkest blue is actually 2 to 3 feet of difference. And I don't think this one has any purple. The purple is over 3 foot of water surface elevation reduction. So you can see we've changed the way the watershed behaves by putting these solutions in. So let's talk through what we've got. So the Friendswood Basin is on a property owned by Harris County Flood Control District. For the purpose of this analysis, we assumed that Friendswood Basin was entirely devoted to providing benefits for the downstream section of the watershed and not offset any upstream improvements. So it's about a 1,350 acre foot basin, which provides benefit to that area, kind of local to it. We also are recommending potentially converting the Timber Creek Golf Course into 2 basins that straddle Turkey Creek to provide additional benefit. So that obviously the golf course provides some benefit as a green space. That golf course could be reimagined into a space that provided additional storage. It could retain some of its current public amenity as a golf course, but it's a very large basin. It would provide 3,600 acre feet storage on either side of Turkey Creek. So in total, that's about 5,000 acre foot of storage for those 2 basins. Since we're in Houston, we have to measure everything in how many astrodomes is that. It's about 5 astrodomes of water stored in those 2 basins. So detention's good, right? We're not saying detention's not good, but it's not good enough by itself. So in order to get the water out faster, we did what's called clearing and desnagging of the channel from FM 1959 down to Bay Area Boulevard. So what does that mean? That means that on the channel banks, up the top of bank, all vegetation we removed that was anything anything smaller than 4 inches in diameter. So if there's a tree that's got a bigger than 4 inch diameter trunk, it stays. Everything else was cut down. It might surprise some people, but because all that undergrowth really inhibits the flow in the channel, and by cutting it down, actually not changing the the channel shape, no dirt moving, we can significantly increase the flow through Friendswood. So that's happening from 1959 down to Bay Area Boulevard. So that's good. The basins are good. That's great. But the problem is, by itself, that's going to create a downstream impact. That's going to cause flooding along these neighborhoods on the south side of Clear Creek before we get to I-45. So in addition to the improvements in Reach 1, we need some improvements in Reach 2. So when we did our analysis, we found there's a lot of concern about the I-45 bridge. The I-45 bridge did cause head loss during Hurricane Harvey. We did a lot of modeling to try to recreate that event, and our conclusion is that the bridge itself was not causing the head loss, but in fact that there was some sort of debris that stuck or snagged on the columns of that bridge, helping to contribute to a greater head loss along I-45. But the structure that is causing the most head loss, just by its nature of existing, is the State Highway 3 and Union Pacific Railroad track. Those two bridges are in close proximity to one another. They've got pretty small openings to get in and out. So those bridges are a problem on the channel. Removing them and replacing them with a bridge that does not have those same constrictions really provides a lot of benefit. You see over a 1 foot reduction right there where those happens, and that reduction actually propagates all the way up to Bay Area Boulevard, which helps prevent this channel improvement from causing a problem. Also at FM 270 right now, the water takes a very long path to get around FM 270. It makes a big kind of peninsula U. We recommend cutting a hole in FM 270 through that earthen embankment and allowing a bypass for the water and a high flow event to flow through there quicker. All right, so now we got the water past FM 270. We're in Clear Lake. We've got the water to Clear Lake faster, right? So in order to make sure we have a better system, we got to make the water get out of the lake faster. So we're going to have to do something at the outlet of Clear Lake to open that up a little bit more and get water out. But we estimate the capital cost of these at $275 million. And we'll talk a little bit about how they have to happen in sequence and then what that looks like. We did also look at the non-cost factor scores. This one's showing a lot of green. Right, green is good. In some cases, this property is publicly owned. We're not actually changing the channel banks, so the permitting of this is a lot simpler than it would be if we were modifying the channel. And then these are kind of distinct individual projects. We're not talking about a 15 or 20 mile channelization project. So something that we think could be implemented pretty well. All right. So what order does it have to be done in? Some of these things can happen in any order, right? There's no mitigation required with the basins. They're self-contained. The outlet expansion is happening at the very downstream end, right? So it doesn't have to be contained. But we can't do some of these things without other things first. We have some predecessor activities. So the Clear Lake outlet expansion has to happen first before you do the FM 270 bypass, before you do the Highway 3 Union Pacific Railroad track bridge, and before you do the clearing and desnagging in Reach 1. You put all those things together and you get a great project, but you have to do them in the right order. Otherwise, while you're working on the project, you're going to create impacts along the way. So how does this stack up quantitatively? So we're going to spend, just on ballpark numbers, of $275 million in capital. And we saw the bar charts before showing flooding instances by event. Right? In a 100-year storm, 24-hour 100-year storm, this would prevent 762 instances of flooding, which has a damage of $83 million. And it would reduce the water source elevation in I-45 by almost a foot. When you look at that on a 50-year basis, you got about 2,000 flooding instances that would be eliminated with a total damage of $62 million. On an efficiency basis, that's 7 instances of flooding for every $1 or every $1 million invested, or about $140,000 per instance of flooding reduced. So I caution us to focus too much on these numbers. They're obviously important because they talk about the riverine aspects. But if we reduce the water source elevation along the channel, we're going to create a lot of local benefits in the storm sewer network. Those numbers are not included here, but this is a good baseline, at least for comparison purposes, between this and the other alternatives. But we want to get this number down, right? $140,000 per instance. Can we get that number down? Can we get more flood reduction for some of these other numbers? That's what we're going to talk about with some of the other combination alternatives. But some takeaways here. So, personally, I was a little surprised that the clearing, because the channel is so vegetated in Reach 1, significantly reduces flooding in Friendswood. That's good news. But the downstream impacts still happen. They're partially offset by the 2 large detention ponds, but not completely. The Highway 3 bridge improvements provide the greater benefit than doing the same thing to I-45. And I-45 actually is already being improved right now. So it's already happening. The Clear Lake outlet expansion helps us make sure that the Highway 3 and FM 270, getting that water through those points, construction points, doesn't cause downstream impact. The challenge we've got, and this is going to be common to all these, is that the storm surge and particularly sea level rise around Clear Lake, which Jim talked about earlier, limits our ability to reduce the water source elevation once you get past FM 270 significantly. It's downstream controlled, and it's a wide water body. There's a lot of risk that's residual to those structures in the lake area, and it's nearly impossible to eliminate the flooding concerns for some of those areas because of that storm surge and sea level rise, no matter how much water is diverted or stored. All right, so talked about the conveyance improvements. Let's talk about the plus a tunnel. So this is identical to the previous case, except we added in a tunnel, which is a big tunnel. So this is 8.5 miles long. It has a conveyance capacity of about 11,000 CFS. So 11,000 basketballs per second could pass through this tunnel at its maximum head condition. That's enough to fill the Astrodome up with water in about an hour. So it's an incredibly high amount of water moving through the system. Starts at FM 2051 and drops it off into Clear Lake. The problem with the tunnel, we talked about, it's expensive, right? So this bumps our capital cost up from $275 million to $1.25 billion. This is the tunnel itself is a nearly $1 billion project. But we can see on the color scheme what it does, right? So all of a sudden that entire section of Friendswood is purple, which means that now the water source elevation from about Turkey Creek down to almost Bay Area Boulevard is now 3 feet or more reduced. And we're not causing a downstream impact because of the second outlet structure, and we're not creating ourselves an environmental or permitting problem along the way because we're not touching the channel downstream of Bay Area Boulevard. So there's some significant benefits, but the yellow line is the approximate route of that tunnel. Now that's something that could be refined much more in the future, and you see there's some bends here that could be potentially taken out. That would give us a little bit more, shorten the distance, and maybe shrink the cost a little bit. But as we go through Friendswood and we go through Houston, we go through Webster, if there's flooding happening along some of these channels, that could be dropped right into the tunnel and give us a chance to get additional benefits. So the mitigation order is similar. We can't get that tunnel built until we improve the outlet, right? Otherwise, that 11,000 CFS is going to cause problems in Clear Lake. Otherwise, the sequencing is the same as previous. Qualitatively, we increased our construction cost a lot. We also increased our benefits. The project benefits on this one increased about 50%, but we increased our project cost by a lot more than 50%. So we are seeing improvements, right? We're seeing over 1,000 structures in a 100-year event. Over the 50-year design life, we're seeing over 3,000 structures. We're seeing the water source elevation drop by an additional foot at I-45, which is a nice improvement. But you look at the efficiency numbers and we say, okay, we were at 140,000, now we're at $400,000 per instance. We need to find a way with this one to get this number down. And part of that is by tying in local benefits, right? Every instance of benefit on a local sewer network brings this number down. So this tunnel is much more effective because it moves a lot more water, but it doesn't necessarily score well just looking at the riverine impacts. We need to tie in the local benefits to that to make it score better. So what do we take away from this one? In some cases, you're getting a more than 5-foot reduction in water source elevation at FM 2051 at the tunnel intake. That's a dramatic change in the floodplain. The discharge of Clear Lake is great as long as we improve the outlet with some better way to get the water to Galveston Bay. The tunnel cost could go down for a few ways. One, make it shorter, take some of those bends out. You also could supplement the tunnel with a pump station. That would allow you to maybe go from 40-foot diameter down to 30, which costs quite a bit less. And also would allow us to pump through storms when we have downstream head conditions like a surge event. The tunnel also presents opportunity for local drainage. We talked about that. We talked about the other ones already. At some point, the downstream end, because of the surge and the high future sea level, we just can't reduce the water source elevation in Clear Lake by that much. All right, so the other tunnel. So we looked at 2 different tunnels. This one has a couple different changes because the tunnel in this case doesn't start until we get to I-45. So the intake is just on the upstream side of I-45. It follows FM 518 out to Galveston Bay directly. It does not go through Clear Lake. In order to make sure we're still providing a lot of benefit in Reach 1, instead of doing the clearing and desnagging, we're benching the channel above the ordinary high water mark from 1959 all the way out to Galveston Bay. So we see still a large benefit, in purple, right, over 3 feet happening up to 2051, and then we got a 2 to 3 foot reduction there, and then it starts to tail off a little bit before getting picked up again by the tunnel. The tunnel is shorter. It's 7.1 miles in length. Same diameter, 40-foot diameter. Because it's further down in the watershed, there's less differential head. It's lower than the FM 2051 tunnel, so it can't move quite as much water by gravity. So this is 8,200 CFS. It would take about an hour and a half, in this case, to fill up the Astrodome. This one performs the best at I-45 by dropping the water circulation over 2 feet. And since there's no discharge to Clear Lake, we essentially create, in this case, almost a third outlet into Clear Lake with the tunnel. So sequencing, the tunnel needs to get built before you built the bypasses at FM 270, the new bridge, and certainly before you did the ordinary high water mark benching through Reach 1. But it could be built without waiting on any other things. In this case, if you wanted to improve, if it was found that, hey, we might as well improve the Clear Lake outlet to Galveston Bay anyway, that's something that could be done, and it would just provide additional benefits, and it would not necessarily be needed to offset benefits. So on a cost basis, this one costs less than the 2051 tunnel. It also has slightly less instances, but kind of in a similar ballpark. It has a better benefit at I-45, slightly less benefit through Friendswood and Reach 1, 2,300 instances of flooding on a 50-year period. Some of this is just because right now Reach 2 does not have as many structures as Reach 1 does, even though it has a greater water source elevation reduction in that area. So much like the tunnel from Reach 1 to the Clear Lake, this one, we need to tie in those local instances of flooding, particularly following 518 through a populated area. There's a lot of opportunities to improve these numbers with those local benefits. So the benching is really effective in Reach 1. It's actually, in some cases, overly effective. We'll look at a water source elevation map in a second. But north of 2051, it reduced the water source elevation so much, we're actually maybe moving too much water downstream, which is kind of washing out our benefit from 2051 down to Bay Area Boulevard. So we might actually say, hey, let's not bench this thing all the way back to 1959. Let's only clear and desnag that section and start the benching at 2051. The benching begins to cannibalize itself once you get upstream of Bay Area Boulevard, which is something we got to keep an eye on. We don't want to make improvements that maximize benefits and don't start cannibalizing themselves by causing flooding. We talked about the no outlet expansion. Just like the other tunnel, this tunnel, and this one it actually could be even benefit greater because it has such little head between the upstream and downstream end. If you put a pump station on it, the diameter could go down, and you probably could move even more water than assumed by gravity here. So get closer to the 11,000 CFS, which would provide additional benefits and additional water source elevation reduction on the creek. All right, so we did a lot of analyses, a lot of different permutations of this. What did we learn looking at kind of the three things in total? So we're back to our map that we had of all the X's along the creek. In this case, the red line is the future conditions 100-year storm, 24-hour event with no project, right? And then we have purple, blue, and yellow. Those are our different combination solutions. So purple is no tunnel, blue is the I-45 tunnel, and yellow is the 2351 tunnel. Let's look at these a little bit, kind of upstream and downstream. So let's focus on upstream first. So zoomed in on the upstream section, this is kind of from Bay Area up to 1959. We've got clearing on the channel, which does provide a pretty significant benefit, multiple feet of reduction happening here through Friendswood, which is, in my opinion, actually was a little surprising. We could get that much benefit just by removing vegetation. You see the tunnel, yellow line, which is the tunnel that starts at 2051, a huge drop. That's right at the intake, right? That's the point of inflection there. Over a 5-foot drop right there at 2051, really taking a lot of those structures out. But we also see that the over high watermark channel benching has a lot of benefit. And this is the kind of what I'm saying with excessive benefit. We almost have too much benefit happening here. Now, that could be a good thing. If we wanted to be able to allow more flow from the upper section of Clear Creek to come through lower Clear Creek, we've got a lot of benefit here that is almost unnecessary. We could maybe say, hey, let's do this as a clearing and desnagging for this section instead, because what's happening is this water is moving more effectively from 1959 downstream and probably washing out some of our benefit between 528 and 2051, which is where most of the structures are at risk. So if we change that back to clearing, I think we'd see this blue line drop a little bit right here where we want it to, which could provide us some benefit and actually cost less because the clearing is cheaper than the high water mark benching. Looking at the downstream end, a couple things jump out. Number one, when you start at the very outlet point, you see all of these alternatives converge very quickly, which is, I think, a little bit surprising because in the case of the I-45 tunnel, which is the blue line, we've moved 8,000 CFS out. It's not going out this way anymore. But remember, this flow rate's now at 84,000 CFS. So 8,000 CFS is a lot, but it's only 10% of the total flow. So it's lower than the other lines, but almost imperceptible. We do see a big drop at I-45 here, and the lowest drop is with the blue line. And I think it could even go lower because I think that 8,000 CFS could potentially be increased to 11,000 CFS with a pump station. But a lot of structures along the lake that could be at risk. This is all done on a slab elevation basis, and structures that we knew were elevated were moved out. But there's probably some structures here that may actually be elevated that aren't shown. But once you see, this is not elevation 0, right? This is not our daily 1 or 2 foot elevation in Clear Lake. This assumes that we've got a 6 foot elevation in Galveston Bay, and so the water surface elevation is elevated, which we did see during Hurricane Harvey. Clear Lake was about 8 feet. All right, so stacking them up side by side. Red again is no project. Purple is conveyance improvements. Blue is the I-45 tunnel, and yellow is 2051 tunnel. So both those tunnel projects perform better than the conveyance improvements, but not as much as we want to see. So we want to find a way to tie in those local improvements. So big picture conclusions. If we do conveyance improvements, we got to get those improvements all the way out to Galveston Bay. Trying to stop water along the creek in one spot is very difficult, creates a lot of problems, and a lot of cost goes up trying to build detention. The benefits indicated in here do not fully account for local drainage solutions, which I think would significantly improve those benefits. Also, when we focused the study, we were looking at how do we mitigate major storms. When we look at a 50-year window, the 50-year window gives you a lot of credit for mitigating 2, 5, and 10-year storm events. It doesn't give you nearly as much credit for doing a great mitigation job on a 500-year storm event, which the tunnels in this case do, because that 500-year storm event, on a statistical basis, shouldn't happen very often in a 50-year window. Even with the new data, though, in the last 50 years, we've had Harvey and Allison and other storms that would tend to make you wonder if the 50-year window is the right metric to look at. That is the metric that we kind of have to look at for some of the funding programs, but it can be challenging. Once you get past I-45, there's in some cases very little you can do to move the water surface elevation by a lot. We can reduce it, right? We can do maybe 6 inches, but we're not going to see a 5 foot change in elevation from what we're doing right now. Now, that could change if the Texas Coastal Study builds the storm surge barrier on Clear Lake. That changes the scenario a little bit. But right now, with an open outlet into Galveston Bay, we're so downstream controlled that we're not going to see major reductions in water surface elevation once you get east to I-45. So tunnel solutions had the best benefit, right? But the 50-year window kind of almost penalizes them because they're really focused on the 100 and 500-year storms. Harvey was bigger than a 100-year storm, and we all know that it lasted more than 24 hours. So conveyance improvements are not duration dependent. So we need those conveyance improvements so that when we have a storm that lasts more than one day, or say it rains really hard on Monday and then it rains really hard on Wednesday, we've got that infrastructure built to get the water out. And that's those conveyance improvements that they provide. All right. Talked about the how. We're talking about the what. Let's talk about the how a little bit. One of the biggest how questions is how do you pay for it? So there's a lot of different ways to pay for these kind of projects. None of them are easy, right? I think we need to be upfront that these are all expensive projects and they're going to be challenging to fund. And it's important that we attack this in a strategic way. There's very rarely going to be free money for projects. Like this saying that there's no free lunch, there's very rarely free money. All these programs that exist have local match requirements in most cases that can be a significant percentage. They have financial reporting requirements, certain contracting rules have to be followed. In some cases can make them more onerous than they are helpful. So we don't want to walk into a funding program with our hand out for money until we understand how it's going to help, how is it going to affect the project, and how can the project use the program, and maybe it may be that there's multiple programs that are used, that we don't try to lump this all into one bucket, right? We use a multiple bucket approach and attack each of these solutions we talked about individually from a funding perspective. So where does the money come from? We got kind of the 6 key entities that are kind of key here. In the center, the Army Corps of Engineers. If you talk about large flood control projects, they are one of the partners that is most commonly engaged. They're actually already engaged in this project. They were part of the Public Assistance to States grant. Were very helpful looking at particularly downstream conditions and providing us technical review comments on our deliverables at this phase. So they're we've had them at our hip helping us through. So they're obviously on that list. FEMA's on that list. FEMA is historically someone who came in after things were bad and helped you recover, but they now have some programs to try to mitigate that risk ahead of time to prevent flooding in the future. The GLO has been implementing some of the funds that came after Hurricane Harvey. A lot of those funds so far have been developed focused on low to moderate income areas and socially vulnerable areas. Based on the demographics and how property is set up along Clear Creek, those programs are not well suited necessarily for these improvements, but we'll have to see how the future phases of that program rolls out. The Water Development Board has got low interest loans, and sometimes they actually have programs that can help fund smaller projects. Department of Agriculture and Housing and Urban Development, same thing. So there's lots of different things out there. It's almost let's find a project and let's see if we can make it fit within some of these requirements. The challenge we're going to have right now, based on our Riverine analysis, is that folks with a calculator at home can say, hey, those benefit cost ratios are not very high, right? They're not a 2.0 benefit cost ratio. In a lot of cases, they're not even close to a 1.0 benefit cost ratio. So that's going to take us out a lot of projects that we just can't fund, because that's one of the key criteria. Some of that's changing. Like, not everything's requiring a benefit cost ratio, and we need to make sure that we're loading our benefit cost ratio with all the benefits. So that's all the local impacts, that's secondary effects from transportation system impacts, from critical infrastructure that goes down. Our Riverine analysis is a great start, and this is the model we developed is a great tool, but it doesn't tell the whole story, right? So as we start trying to attract funds, we need to make sure we're telling that entire story by integrating in all the benefits that it's providing. All right, so other people's money is fantastic. It helps us fund projects, and it's something that we certainly need to look into for this project. But one of the questions is how could this project be funded locally? When you fund something locally, you have ultimate control, and in a lot of cases, even if you get other people's money, we're going to need to have a local match. So how could we create that local match? So there's a few different ways to think about this. One of them is in the 1990s, there was a flood control district proposed for Clear Creek. It was created and passed by the Texas legislature in 1995. At that time, it was set up with a 5-person governing board with two commissioners from Harris County, one from Brazoria, one from Galveston, and one from Fort Bend County. And they were appointed by the commissioners' courts. So this entity was created. But in order for it to have taxing authority and have the ability to fund projects, it had to go to a local vote. It failed that local vote in 1998, due in large part, I'll be honest, I didn't live here in 1998, but reading the news articles from that time, it failed in large part because people were opposed to the project that it was trying to fund, and that was a major channel improvement to Clear Creek. So a local flood control district may be a good tool, right? It would require the state to reinitiate legislation, but in order for it to get a local vote passed and to have the funding capabilities it needs to fund projects, it would have to have a project that has public support. So part of what we're doing now is to develop projects with public support so we can get the benefits out to the community. Everyone understands why we're doing this, and so something like this could happen if it was seen as a benefit for the area. So what would that district look like? I mean, we already have the Harris County Flood Control District. We already have the Galveston County Consolidated Drainage District. We already have Brazoria County District 4. Why do we need another district? Well, for better or for worse, Clear Creek is a boundary stream. So there's lots of entities that are sort of responsible for Clear Creek, or responsible for half of Clear Creek, or responsible for a section of Clear Creek. There's no entity that's responsible for the entirety of Clear Creek. So we are not suggesting an entity be created that wipes out the other entities. We're suggesting an entity be created that has a specific purpose. And that purpose is support capital improvements and operations and maintenance for the main channel of Clear Creek to mitigate flooding impacts. So it's an entity that would partner with the other entities and potentially be the entity that's the local partner for federal or state aid for the flood control district, and an entity that could generate significant tax revenue from the properties in the watershed. So $48 billion of properties in the Clear Creek watershed. Now, this is an entity that would probably need to have benefits for everybody. So Lower Clear Creek and Upper Clear Creek, how could an entity like this benefit both of those? Tying all the products that are considered together, something that local and state leaders will need to think about as we look at some of these major projects on Clear Creek. So is there an example of something like this that's being considered? So the answer is yes. So the Gulf Coast Protection District is being discussed right now. This is happening in real time. So I was notified that my slide is out of date and that Brazoria County is no longer on this list of the Gulf Coast Protection District, but there are a lot of different entities that are included in here. The purpose of this district is to be the local sponsor for the storm surge barrier system for Galveston Bay, which potentially includes a gate at Clear Lake and on Dickinson Bayou. So there's a big dollar sign for the construction, and then there's maintenance. So this district would be responsible for both of those things. Similar structure could be proposed for Clear Creek, or the Gulf Coast Protection District would require some changes to how it's planned, could potentially have some additional flood control benefits tied into it. Much larger project covering a much larger area, but something that is a good example for what that looks like. All right, I'm going to take a big breath, and I'm going to hand it back to our project director and moderator, Chuck Wolf. Thanks for sticking with me.
Thank you, Brian. So let's talk a little bit about the path forward from where we are. So as I mentioned at the very beginning of this, we've done a lot of work, as you guys have seen on tonight's presentation, and we've come quite a ways. But as John Baumgartner said, projects and concepts like what we're talking about here for Clear Creek don't simply get solved in one planning watershed study. So there's some work that we need to do specific to the study itself to get things wrapped up, and then there's some additional phases of consideration that will need to be taken under advisement. So the next steps with respect to the actual study itself is to work on finalizing these combination alternatives based on feedback we received from the public tonight, as well as feedback we will receive through written documentation and questions that you may be submitting to the site over the next week or so. And we're going to, and the last slide on this will give you that information if you have follow-up comments or thoughts after you get a chance to look through the materials. We'll finalize the study with written documentation, including the recommended path forward on the alternatives based upon that analysis. And then we'll also identify needs in future study phases or future work phases to assess the benefits to local drainage systems and increase the project benefit metrics. As we mentioned, this is a mainline channel study to provide a lot of benefit. The more we can drop or a lot of benefit in understanding how much we can drop that water level in Clear Creek. And of course, the lower that's able to get, everything else can work better going to it. So those are sort of our next steps specific to the study itself. Can you go to the next slide, Brian? So some final thoughts, some summary items that Brian and Jim and others have pointed to throughout the presentation. So there's definitely solutions that exist to reduce flood risk in major events. As you've seen, they are expensive, so they'll require some significant level of local investment as well as partnerships with other levels of government and other entities. Local drainage system benefits have the potential to increase those total project benefits, which potentially could open up the door to additional funding opportunities. So that's something that would be a good evaluation going from here. Conveyance improvements upstream cannot be constructed without additional improvements downstream to Galveston Bay. That's clearly one of the things that we've seen and you saw tonight in each one of the modeling analyses. You have to sort of improve this from the bottom back up as opposed from the top down, or you have to be able to have space to be able to make those appropriate improvements so you don't create those downstream impacts. Regardless of the improvements, there will be some residual risk that will remain. So that can be addressed through elevating structures and buyouts as one option. But that's one of the elements of an area that's really pretty much fully developed, is you don't have a lot of places for the water to go. And so there's going to be some residual risk that will remain. The risk at Clear Lake and the surrounding area is heavily influenced by Galveston Bay. So additional riverine conveyance without some sort of surge barrier will have minimal impact on that actual bay risk. So that's something that we've seen from the study that would also probably bear further fruit from further evaluation as far as how those interactions happen. Next slide, Brian. So we've got quite a bit of feedback this evening through the chat. We've got many people who are on the call as well. We realize not everybody's going to be able to put their questions in this evening, and maybe not. We won't be able to respond to all the questions. So we do encourage additional feedback, especially after you get a chance to review the materials. You can email the team at lccdb@leaguecity.com, or there are online forms on the city's website, and that's at www.leaguecity.com/LCCDB. So we encourage you and hope that you'll take the time to provide additional follow-up comments and questions if you have them and we can't get to them this evening. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Rachel.
Thank you, Chuck and Brian, and thank you to the project team. This concludes the presentation portion of tonight's meeting, and now we will move on to the Q&A. As I mentioned earlier, any questions or comments that were asked earlier in the chat and that were not addressed during the presentation have been cataloged in our queue. And during this portion of the meeting, I will read the comments or questions as they were received, the ones that were not answered, and the members of the project team, panelists will answer based on the nature of the question and subject. We encourage all comments and communication with the team this evening, and all comments and questions will be captured in the study documentation. So as a reminder, you may email the project team at lccdb@leaguecity.com. So our first question in the queue is, we have answered quite a few. Steve Rocky, do you recall what Harvey was calculated as a certain number of year flood?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, I don't know if some of our guys were looking up.
Brian, did we lose
Brian's
you?
breaking up.
Oh, I think we lost Brian for a second.
Several folks have, after Harvey, a lot of people looked at trying to answer that question of what was the recurrence interval. The challenge with that was because it was so far off the charts, is that you start extrapolating what we have in terms of data. You start extrapolating that line out, and so there's a lot of uncertainty. So some people were saying it was like 24,000 year event or 50,000 year event, and so at that point it kind of really becomes very hard to quantify, and I think also kind of not really a very meaningful value at that point either of what type of storm it was, or what the recurrence interval was.
All right. The next question is, it should be, we have, scroll down a little bit, upstream Clear Creek projects and Friendswood appear to have increased flow downstream through significant clearing of creek banks. Significant commercial development is Webster off NASA 1 bypass, and development occurs faster than the study timeline. What is being done to ameliorate the downstream Clear Creek flooding risk to League City and Nassau Bay?
Yeah, so I'll take a shot at this one, and then others can add to it. So this is sort of one of the things that we hit on as we went through this analysis, and I think everybody sort of knows this. The more you improve the waterway upstream, the more water you're going to send down, and eventually it has to slow down someplace. When it slows down, it widens out. So part of what we've been doing with these solutions is trying to find ways to get that conveyance all the way out to the bay. And as Brian pointed out in his presentation, if you try to store it, you're going to fill it up. If you fill it up, then it might as well be concrete because it's just going to flow through it. So I guess the short answer to what is being done to ameliorate, good word, the downstream Clear Creek flooding risk is we're trying to come up with solutions that get all of the water, as much of the impactful water as we can, out to the bay. That is the only detention basin big enough to handle the flows that we're dealing with. So that's the plan. There's been a lot of discussion both last night as well as tonight about how development can occur within the areas and how there can be coordination and collaboration amongst the agencies around that development. That's not necessarily the purview of this particular engineering study, but it is something that we would certainly endorse and support as far as the more long-term planning for how all of these packages and projects have to come together to overall reduce flood risk and help the channel perform better.
Excellent. Thank you, Chuck. And we have another comment here. So what I'm hearing with all of this tunnel talk and the astrological cost is how are we going to get $1.25 billion from the Congress, from this Congress?
Yeah, that's a good question. An astronomical cost, I think was the thing. So
Yes.
I heard a data point many, many years ago, and it may have been only 5%, but it's a very small percentage of our entire water infrastructure in the United States that was built with federal funds. So there was a lot of flood management, obviously, that was done because the Corps of Engineers did so much of that work. There's an element of this that is going to have to be funded locally. And part of what I think Brian hit on this, and we talked about options and other options. I think part of this is on Clear Creek, we've got one side of the creek, which is in Harris County. Harris County Flood Control has been looking at things. The other side of the creek, we've got multiple cities, multiple jurisdictions. We've got Galveston County and what Galveston County is trying to do. There's going to be some element of local, and then there's going to be some element that could come from other governmental entities. So part of the benefit of this project is that we've had so many of those entities, including the Corps of Engineers, engaged in providing not only input but advice and guidance on items, and that's going to be something that would have to continue going forward in the future. So I am not giving up the ghost that there's a solution here that can be funded and constructed. It's not a simple solution, however, and I think we knew that going into this process, and certainly the evaluations have sort of proven out that there's going to be quite a bit of work to do. But there is quite a bit of potential benefit that could come from it as well.
Yeah, and astronomical is a good adjective. The tunnel cost is really high. It is a big number, right? It's the most expensive thing we looked at in the study between Dickinson Bayou and Clear Creek. One other thing we need to think about with this project is we want to get something that we can implement, right? So that means we need to be able to pay for it, which is a big part of it. But we also need to be able to permit it, and we need to be able to permit it in a timely manner. So there's been a lot of questions I think coming up about can we just change the wetland delineations or could we expand the wetland areas from Bay Area Boulevard to FM 270? I think the short answer to that is yes. Could it be done? Yes. Will it take 10 or 20 years to permit something like that? Possibly. And could you even find the mitigation areas is a question mark. One of the reasons the tunnel is looked at is that it alleviates all of that thing. All of those different things. So if you're able to find the funding for the tunnel, the ability to permit it is very high because it has very little impact on the upstream and downstream side. And unlike a channel solution, which has a significant impact all the way through.
Excellent. The next question is, what percentage of the watershed is currently undeveloped? Is there a plan to purchase and conserve or place in conservation easement to prevent continued increase in runoff and impervious surface?
Yeah, Boris, I know you work on that in the background. I don't think we have a firm percentage, but the Clear Creek watershed is mostly developed. I think looking at it, it's about 90% developed, but plus or minus 5% in that range. So unlike Dickinson Bayou, which is predominantly undeveloped, Clear Creek is very much developed, and we weren't seeing in most cases, especially in this lower section, we weren't seeing portions of causing high flow rate just changes in the future condition. Is that right, Jim?
Yeah, that's right. And I guess and I put this answer in the chat, but while we're not aware of any specific plans to purchase or conserve open space, there are detention requirements in place for development to mitigate increases in runoff due to impervious surface.
Great. We have a question about the Clear Creek Flood Control District. He's saying that the comment is saying that Harris County residents have already approved $2.5 billion in flood control bonds. We're in the city of Friendswood and have stepped up and approved $41 million for drainage improvements to Clear Creek and Friendswood.
And you're absolutely correct. Those things are totally true. I think that the focus of the Clear Creek Flood Control District and why it potentially is important, and honestly, this is not something that we as the consultant tonight get to say is a good idea or not a good idea. We're putting it up as something to consider, right? And it's something that the public officials for the state and your local leaders will have to think about it, and then should be voted on. Is that those funds for Harris County, which are very important, did a lot of good, had to go across the entire county, right? This is something that would focus on local infrastructure and provide an entity that would be able to control the focus of the entire watershed. It could potentially have the ability to provide guidance on what the development criteria were in the watershed, as well as fund projects, and make sure that they were maintained in a way that met the residents and the voting people's expectations. So it's a local control solution that solves the, Clear Creek has a lot of cooks in the kitchen because of all the different entities that make it up along the boundary. It would try to simplify that in some way.
Thank you, Brian. This is another question that I think may have been answered, but it goes in a little bit more detail. Noticing that there were over $1 billion in damaged structures for a 500-year event in Friendswood, have any of the combined alternatives been looked at for a 500-year event or for a Harvey-like storm?
Jim, you want to take that one?
Sure. So we did evaluate these combined alternatives for the full range of flood events, including the 500-year event. We did not, just to kind of, in terms of time constraints and modeling constraints, we did not yet run the Harvey storm event through the proposed mitigation scenarios. But that is something that can be done and will be valuable, I think, in future phases.
Yeah, just to help answer that question, I'm going to share my screen, and this does show that this bar chart on the far left side is that 500-year storm event, right? So in that event, we've got $900 million of damage happening. We've got almost, in some cases, almost half of it being reduced by some of the different mitigation scenarios. So it is something we're looking at, and the good news is that we have this model now, and so we have the ability to run additional scenarios, additional mitigation ideas. If changes are being planned to large areas of the land, the municipalities and counties will have this model, and they could check and see how that's going to be affected along the creek. So this is intended to be a tool that can go forward and update what was a relatively older model on Clear Creek with the new LiDAR data, new rainfall data, and can be used going forward for future development as well.
All right. This next question I can answer partially, and if Brian, if you want to add to it, will all the Q&A be posted? I can give you the short answer in that we will be capturing all the comments and responses in the Phase 3 documentation and in the Lower Clear Creek Watershed Study documentation. And then the next question, if local flows combine into the tunnels, won't that reduce the flood reduction benefits seen along Clear Creek?
That's a good question. I'll start, and Jim can chime in on this. The riverine analysis assumes that local flow is getting to the creek through a 2D mesh. Now, whether it's getting it through the 2D mesh or getting it through a culvert, it's still getting there. Sometimes the timing is a little bit different for how long it takes it to get from one place to another. So it's something we need to check, but I don't think we would see it necessarily a major reduction in benefit along the main channel by tying in local drainage. But it's something that would need to be checked.
Yeah, I think the other good benefit that the tunnel provides is that a lot of these smaller local storm drains are going to be able to dump in and connect to that tunnel, and would likely kind of drop into the tunnel before the tunnel is full. And so that allows that flow to go ahead and get in the tunnel and get out. Because again, as Brian, I think, discussed earlier, the tunnel is pure conveyance, and as long as there's head driving it, it's moving water. So I think
you brought up a good point.
Kind of combined benefit.
I realized that in my discussion, I forgot to mention the tunnel is intended to be dry between storm events. And so the first flow in the tunnel is actually creates like a giant detention pond. And at the end of the storm, over the next, say, 3 to 5 days, it's dewatered. So that water the tunnel captures, which is a very large volume because it's so long and so big in diameter, is captured as detention for the event. So that those 2, 5, 10-year events, like Jim mentioned, that may cause flooding in the streets, have somewhere to go, which is an important thing. But it's something that would need to be checked in the model. It is a good question. We need to make sure we're not washing out the benefit from the channel by tying in local things.
The next question is, one of the combination models involved putting in the I-45 tunnel and revising the Highway 3 and FM 270 bridges to be more direct. Nassau Bay is immediately downstream of FM 270. Will the I-45 tunnel relieve enough water to prevent the FM 279 bridge revision from pouring more water or higher water levels into Nassau Bay? Right now, models show minimal decrease in water height. I'm concerned with model errors resulting in increase in water elevation.
Excellent question, and that's where we talked about the project sequencing needing to happen. Obviously, the tunnel has to happen first. If you don't build the tunnel first and you have those 2 improvements, the water is going to end up in Clear Lake by going right by Nassau Bay faster. And so that's something that as we get more detailed into the analysis, we can confirm. I think the 8,000 CFS for the tunnel is actually less than we could push through there with some improvements. So I think you probably could see even greater benefit. There is also an option, right? We said it's not necessary based on our modeling to improve outlet capacity from Clear Lake into Galveston Bay. But if you added additional outlet capacity from Clear Lake into Galveston Bay, you would see even greater benefits all the way back to Nassau Bay in that area.
I think, and the other thing I'll add, just kind of on the model error part of that question is yeah, all models have error, and that's an important point. And right now we're still at a very conceptual phase for these project concepts, and so as we identify projects that got legs and can move into more feasibility and preliminary design, definitely more detailed analysis and modeling will be done to reduce that uncertainty and error.
Great. The next question is, please expand the mentioned benefit of cutting a straighter route for Clear Creek at FM 270.
Sure. We don't have a great figure in the presentation. That there'll be one in the final report that shows this in more detail. But at FM 270, the Clear Creek turns from going west to east to going north for a little while. Then it goes under the FM 270 bridge and it goes back south. And it doesn't cover a whole lot of east to west ground. So it has a lot of what we call sinuosity in the channel at that point. We would not reroute the base flow in the creek through this bypass, but when the water source elevation came up a little bit higher, ordinary high water mark higher, it would have a bypass channel to go through, and it shortens the distance between point A and point B. It lets water get out of the system faster, and it increases the total cross-section for that part of the stream, which means less head loss and more water getting out faster, which results in greater conveyance through the structure.
Great. Thank you. If Turkey Creek and Harris County Flood Control proceed with their conveyance projects, and Brazoria County and Harris County Flood Control and the Corps proceed with their federal project, that will have a major conveyance problem right at FM 1959 to FM 528. The benefits we have established to Emerald Estates will be negated by those projects with the Friendswood Basin and the Timber Creek Basin. Will the federal project and the Turkey Creek project be sequenced with those projects below I-45, so Friendswood?
So a good question.
South of Friendswood, excuse me.
Yeah, so good question, an understandable concern. We spent a lot of time tonight talking about how we need to build conveyance from the Galveston Bay side all the way up through the system. And obviously the federal project is stopping at FM 1959. And so I understand the concern about how we can't let the water get, it's going to cause, so the thought is if we build improvements upstream of 1959, it's going to cause impacts downstream. The good news is the federal project and the work that flood control is doing, that project cannot be constructed if it's going to cause impacts downstream 1959. That is one of the, Harris County is a no adverse impact entity, and so that cannot be built unless they can prove that those impacts are not going to happen. So I understand the concern because it's a logical thing to think through. But the good news is that project cannot be constructed. So they're talking about additional detention and modifying the project to make sure it does not cause those impacts down in 1959. But a good question. Chuck or Jim, anyone to add to that?
No, nothing to add to it, Brian. I think everybody understands that particular concern, and it's just something we have to continue working through. I don't think we can give a much better answer than that, unfortunately, right now.
We have another question related to say Philip's question, but all of the projects we hear about upstream of Friendswood are conveyance projects. How is that allowed to occur?
So the short answer is that they're conveyance projects combined with a significant amount of detention. So a lot of cases, those channels are being widened and benched substantially, and a lot of those widened and benched areas are actually being treated as detention because they don't get back to the channel unless they overflow. So in order to build additional conveyance and improve the channel, they've got to pair that with detention to prevent the downstream impacts. So that's something that I know they're working through right now, still in process.
Okay. Is there a plan to mitigate the loss of critical in-water habitat that the debris removal will cause for local aquatic and semi-aquatic wildlife? And is there a maintenance budget included for debris removal, and how often will it need to be repeated?
So good question. So the intent is not to take any aquatic habitat out of the channel itself. We're talking about the overbank area, which is on a daily basis dry, and removing the debris and other structures from that area, which obviously when the water circulation goes up and there's a lot of debris and vegetation, it cuts down on the conveyance capacity. Part of the reason that it needs to be removed in a significant manner, everything smaller than a 4-inch diameter is most everything, right? Large trees will stay, everything else is going to be taken out. So that the area can be mowed and cleaned at least a couple times a year. I know Galveston County Consolidated Drainage District is already doing that for some portions of the channel through Friendswood, and it would be an expansion of what they've done. I think in some cases they cut down everything. It wasn't necessarily keeping any trees. We'd like to keep some of the canopy in, which is why they have the 4-inch diameter recommendation there. But it would be something that would need to be maintained. So that maintenance has to happen by the existing entities, Galveston County Consolidated, Harris County, the cities, or another discussion point for the Clear Creek Flood Control District. It could be that entity's responsibility to do the operations and maintenance. This analysis, our cost was focused on the capital costs and not operations and maintenance costs. And so there is an operations and maintenance cost there, but it's something that all the entities are already doing on the channels, keeping them clean. So it would just be an extension of those activities that are already happening, other channels and conduits.
This commenter says that they like the tunnel at FM 528, probably because it helps my home the most, and it seems like it has a good impact cost benefit. That option can be looked at closer as another combination. Also, how about 2 intakes at different locations with a larger diameter tunnel where the 2 intakes join to accommodate greater outflow of the 2 intakes?
I think this is my favorite comment of the evening, because everyone knows I like talking about tunnels. I think that's certainly something that can be looked at. We looked at the 5 different alignment points along the creek. The 2051 tunnel picks up a lot of the benefit that even goes further south, almost all the way down to FM 528. FM 528, south FM 528, there's a lot less structures than there are between 2051 and 528, so that's why that one performed a little better numerically. But certainly there could be, tunnels can have combinations of different intake structures. There could be a Y that's built, that they have a mainline tunnel that branches off into 2 different sections. Those are certainly things that could be looked at as we get further into the analysis, if we can prove that it provides greater benefit.
Excellent. The next question is, have you ever seen a collaborative project encompassing this many jurisdictions? If so, how do your experiences compare, and is there any benefit to the data collected and tools created outside of the projects developed?
So I can take this one. So yes, we've seen projects with this or even more jurisdictions be successfully delivered and be very collaborative. Every single entity that gets added to the process adds complexity. and everybody brings their own perspectives to that. We've even heard that in the questions this evening, upstream, way upstream, downstream. But it can be done. It requires, in my experience, it requires a unifying reason for doing it. And I don't think we're too far downstream for Harvey to be that unifying reason still, or the next Harvey to be that reason, or the next set of events that we're trying to protect against. So it can be done. There are many cases where things don't work out. It is a careful process. All the parties have to be collaborative. I think what's been done with this project to this point, with League City taking lead on bringing together the parties and then everybody contributing something to the process is an example of how you would have to go forward and do that. Benefit of the data collected and tools created outside of the projects that are developed. Clearly, there's a lot of data that's been developed on Clear Creek already. There's a lot of data that we were able to use from others and put things together. So I think there's benefit from that. I think there's benefit from what could be developed in future phases of looking at the potential solution set coming out of this. But there is an element of how would you programmatically put this together to be successful, and how you fund it plays into that, how you select your capital delivery method plays into that, and then making sure that all the parties are able to, stakeholders are able to achieve the goals that they need to achieve out of it. So it can be done. It is not easy. I'm just saying it's something that can be just done without a lot of planning. But yes, we think it could be done, and we think from what we've seen with the folks that we've had the opportunity to work with here, it could be done here too.
Excellent. Thank you, Chuck. Just a few more questions. Did you run any cost numbers on how much it would cost to buy out all homes that are in the 5 or 10-year floodplains by reaches?
Not yet. That's something that we have mapped. We would want to go out and confirm with the survey to make sure that those homes that we have flagged really are at that elevation, and they haven't already been elevated in some cases. We did a lot of Google Earth Street View verifications, but that's not necessarily perfect. So that's something that certainly could be developed. We have the elevation maps. We can lay that on a surface and do some property surveys to find out where those structures are and how to protect them. The good news is for Clear Creek, on a 2 and 5 year basis, there really aren't that many structures that are at risk. If you guys were tuned in last night to Dickinson Bayou, that's a different discussion. There's a lot of structures there. Clear Creek's got pretty good performance in the smaller events. Even the 10-year storm doesn't have nearly as many impacts as other waterways. But yeah, those data points can be developed with the work products from this study.
Excellent.
Rachel, can you unmute Scott Elmer? I know we do have some folks from Harris County Flood Control on here. I know there's a lot of questions about the upstream federal project. I did my best, but I'm not as good at explaining it as Scott is.
Yes, I need to find his name in this queue. Yep. It's not letting me do a search. Hold on. Here we go. There we go. You should be good, Scott. If you have anything else to add. Yep, go ahead.
No, this is Scott Elmer with Harris County Flood Control District. Brian did answer the question, as did Chuck, really well. Just wanted to reaffirm the commitment of Harris County Flood Control on our federal project north of 1959, that we are no adverse impact agency, and we are committed to making sure there's no increase in the water surface elevation outside the federal project limits. And just wanted to confirm in person the commitment of Harris County Flood Control on that.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate you joining in and helping answer that question.
A few more questions are added. Do flood control damage numbers, calculations, money calculations consider the time phasing of increased flooding drivers and flood mitigation projects, both short-term and long-term? Many of the proposed improvements are 5, 10, 20-year projects, and conditions are likely to be much, much worse.
That's a good question. So, we look at the damage numbers. Those are all based on appraisal district values for 2021, right? Recent value numbers. We all know that property increases in value. Unfortunately, construction costs generally increase in cost over time also. And they said they tend to sort of track each other on a cost basis. But as the watershed builds out and as properties improved, things will create greater damage in the future, right? Because the properties are worth more. Another reason to emphasize getting things done quickly, right? Speed of implementation matters. We don't want to be sitting here 30 years from now still debating what to do on the lower section of Clear Creek, because at that point we would have had more events causing flooding and the damages are going to be higher, population is going to increase, right? And so we're going to have all those things happening. So that's why we have that non-cost factor for speed of implementation included in the analysis.
And Brian, just the other thing I would add is just to kind of restate that the future conditions numbers that we presented tonight were based on that 50-year future condition. So in terms of land development conditions and sea level rise, we are essentially kind of looking 50 years into the future. We can't necessarily predict the property values, as you mentioned, but we are looking from a flood impact. We're looking 50 years in the future. And we do understand these projects take, these kind of major projects are going to take, as you said, 5, 10, 20 years to implement, and that's another reason that we look at this 50-year planning period.
Right, and future structures will be built, right? We can't account for whether they'll flood or not, but it is important that those future structures, when constructed, will be built at an elevation where they won't flood, right? That they're built up above the elevations that we know are problems. And this analysis will help inform that even more than the current floodplain maps. Jim's kind of an expert on some floodplain mapping. What we see now is the newly adopted floodplain maps are not new data. They're not Atlas 14 data. So this data set we have here is a better look at the real risk along the creek for water surface than what those floodplain maps show.
Yeah, that actually kind of gets to the second part of Hank Doogie's question earlier about any benefits to the data collected and the tools created outside of just these looking at mitigation projects. And the answer is yeah, these models can be a tool for development right now to help plan and execute projects. It kind of represents the best available snapshot of your flood risk.
Excellent. We have a few more questions. There are a lot of questions coming in about the presentation being emailed, and we appreciate you adding your email address, and we will absolutely get that final draft to you either this evening or the final within the next 24 hours or so. But thank you for
chime in real quick, Rachel.
Yes, of course.
Hey, so this is Anthony Toledo with the City of League City. Just wanted to point out to everyone that the presentations for Dickinson Bayou and the one that was presented tonight is currently already posted to League City's website. So if you visit the website discussed previously, leaguecity.com/LCCDB, you'll be able to find both PowerPoint presentations there.
Thank you, Anthony. One question is, what is the primary material of the tunnel structure, and what is the expected life of the tunnel and maintenance costs?
Great question. So the tunnel will be lined with concrete. The tunnel is constructed in this kind of geology in Houston with precast concrete segments. And in this kind of geology below the water table, the tunnel's useful life is really probably, it would be rated at 100 years. But in reality, that tunnel essentially would last nearly forever. There's tunnels that are over 100 years old in the United States and other parts of the world. And there's operations and maintenance. This is a gravity system that would be drained between storms, and it would have very little maintenance. The San Antonio River Tunnel has been operating over 20 years and has very little maintenance, very little sediment accumulation. That goes into how you design it, but it is intended to be a low-impact asset, both during construction and to operate.
Great. Did any cities give you instructions, requirements to not have structure buyouts? If more water was moved past I-45, would it not be more cost-effective to buy out impacted properties versus high cost of tunneling?
So no one gave us direction to not look at structure buyouts, and I think one of the recommendations in tonight's presentation was that we should consider still looking at structure buyouts. We did take into consideration, and a lot more analysis would be needed to look at the economics of this, but we did take into consideration the economic and financial impacts of structure buyouts as an element of what, when you're looking at the total cost benefit of it. So, The other thing is it may or may not still be more efficient to do structure buyouts when we're looking at these high flow events. So structure buyouts on lower events that you really can't protect against, residual risk events, that's one thing. When you get up to really high flow events like these more expensive options are trying to address, it's one of those things where the diminishing returns on the buyouts, you don't have enough space. So, but no, we didn't get any direction on quite frankly, any of the options that we put out as far as people saying don't do this or don't consider this. It was a pretty open review of the work.
Yeah, and it may not be buyouts all the time. It could be elevation as well, particularly around Clear Lake, right? Yeah. With the storm surge risk, elevation may be a solution that lets you stay where you are and reduce your risk factors.
Yep.
This is somewhat of a follow-up question, I think, to the other tunnel question, Brian. How does a tunnel mitigation stay dry between events, and how is its integrity maintained in our soil conditions?
So the tunnel intake structure and outlet structure are going to have a weir on either side to prevent water from coming in and going out. The tunnel is actually probably designed not to take any water until you get to about a 10-year water elevation in the creek, because up to that point, the creek functions pretty well. We see in our analysis that the properties along the creek have pretty minimal impacts. So the tunnel wouldn't take water until you got to about a 10-year elevation on the upstream side. On the downstream side, it wouldn't discharge right into Galveston Bay at normal levels, because we don't want the Galveston Bay water flooding the tunnel either. So it'd be a few feet above that, so that it would have some protection on both ends. And when you're 100 feet below grade in Houston, you've got pretty consistent geology. It's sandy and clay ground, but it does stay pretty much where it is. We need to do some analysis to make sure there's not any faults that are being crossed. In Houston, not going to have an earthquake, but everything is sliding out into Galveston Bay slowly. So we want to make sure, sorry, not the Galveston Bay, in the Gulf of Mexico slowly, geology. So there's some things to look at there, but generally speaking, the tunnel should perform well over the long term.
Well, getting to the end, but for Hurricane Harvey, do you have data comparing water heights in Galveston Bay, Clear Lake, Clear Creek, and Nassau Bay, Clear Creek just upstream of FM 270, and just upstream of I-45? And what were the height differences? Harvey had minimal storm surge. It seemed like the water just couldn't get out of the Clear Lake.
So we're pulling some of that data points right now that some of those questions are coming up. The Clear Lake itself, it wasn't a storm surge problem, but Galveston Bay had so much water in it from some mild storm surge, and also so much water leaving the Houston area, that there was an elevated condition in Galveston Bay, about 5 or 6 feet. So it was having to fight that downstream condition. Jim, do you have some of the other data that Boris is pulling up?
Yeah, we did have high watermark data in several of those areas. I can tell you at I-45, we did see about a 3-foot water surface elevation difference between the upstream and downstream side. That's kind of the entire highway, the main lanes and the access roads. But we could provide some more of those data points.
And that condition is one we have tried to recreate with the model, with changing the way it looks. Other consultants have tried to create with the model, and we've been unable to do so, which tends to imply that something else was creating head loss at I-45 during that storm, which is likely and reasonable to assume there was could be a bunch of debris and other materials trapped against those bridge piers, kind of closing off the flow path, which would create additional head loss. Which another good reason to do clearing and desnagging upstream is to get that stuff out of the way so it can't get picked up in a big storm and washed down and get caught on a bridge.
Excellent. To put a high point in, Steve Rocky said before we leave, I just want to say this is a very impressive piece of work with some fabulous ideas. Please, thank you.
Thanks,
on
Steve.
behalf of the project team.
I did see a question here about the model that was done. Did we model the wide terracing floodplain option that was proposed? Some of the earlier Friendswood studies that had essentially the maximum channel section. That is something that we did model, and we did model in our individual modeling analysis. We did not include it in the combination analysis because it didn't provide a lot more benefit than we saw with the benching, and it provided significant downstream impact problems by moving more water downstream. So we kind of looked at multiple different levels, from the clearing to the high water mark benching to the full channel modification. Obviously, the full channel modification gets into a lot more environmental permitting challenges than just the benching above the high water mark. and we didn't feel like the results it provided were dramatically better to justify the cost and the permitting challenges above just the high watermark benching. But it was modeled, and it would be included in the final report, how it looked.
There's a couple more questions that we'll just get to before the end of the meeting. What kind of sea level rise did USA COE have factor in? That's the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers.
You want to take that one?
Yep.
Sure.
The Corps of Engineers, yeah, they have several different projections that they use. They kind of have a low, medium, and high projection in terms of sea level rise. We use the medium scenario for this analysis just because obviously there's a lot of uncertainty in those numbers. We have some additional data that can be provided on that in terms of the analysis that was sent from the Corps. But basically there's those three different scenarios, and we use the medium scenario.
Did you use any FEMA flood insurance risk data, and do your results correlate to FEMA?
Yeah, the challenge there, and I think Brian brought this up a minute ago, is that right now the current FEMA mapping is not based on the Atlas 14 rainfall. And so there's not really a good kind of one-to-one correlation there. What you do see a little bit of is because the new 100-year storm is kind of somewhat equivalent to the old 500-year storm, there is a little bit of a correlation there. But we did not really directly compare our results to the FEMA results, just kind of for that reason.
Yeah, so the existing FEMA 500-year floodplain will look similar to the Atlas 14 100-year floodplain. Is that right, Jim? Clarify that.
Yes.
Okay.
Just two more questions. Does detention really offset conveyance in multiple day rain events like Harvey, and detention ponds can fill up and stop working?
Good question. The answer is it depends, right, on what the frequency of those events are, how many days, how hard it rains. Even if it doesn't rain as hard, it's still raining. That's an analysis that we can do to look at multiple day events and how much benefit can be provided. But everyone knows that detention eventually fills up. And so conveyance is better when you can make it work for that reason. Conveyance always moves water, whereas detention at some point has ultimate capacity. Even massive reservoirs like Barker and Addicks at some point have an ultimate capacity, and so they need more conveyance.
How does a gravity-fed tunnel drain when there is a storm surge event that significantly raises the receiving water level, or will the tunnel only function during overland events exclusively?
Good question. So the tunnel operates on differential water surface elevation. So if the upstream end is higher than the downstream end water surface, it will move water. And so in our application, that will always be true. At I-45, the water elevation will always be higher than Galveston Bay. And at 23D1, the water elevation will always be higher than at Clear Lake. Now, the question is how much higher? The bigger the differential, the more water it moves. And so that's why in some applications going forward, we could look at pump stations that would allow us to make sure we met that total criteria at all times. Pump stations have problems, right? They need backup power. Pumps may not work all the time. They create some uncertainty. It's not as good as gravity. But when we're fighting storm surge, they do provide the ability to make sure we can move that, say, 11,000 CFS under almost every condition. And that otherwise, in some cases, that 11,000 CFS could be eroded down to, say, 6,000 or 7,000 CFS if the downstream condition causes a problem.
I think we'll take one more question before the end of the meeting. If you use a much wider 400 to 500 foot benching or terracing, doesn't data show that you have an inline detention effect versus just pushing more water downstream faster?
Jim, you want to talk about that one?
Yeah, I guess, we did not specifically model, channel benching that wide, just because at that point, in this area, you're taking out a lot of houses. So, we would have to model that. I think you're still, as long as you're kind of further upstream from Bay Area Boulevard, you're providing a lot of additional conveyance. When you get to maybe, the lower end, and it's just flatter, you might get more storage. It's all kind of a combination. It's both storage and conveyance. And the question is kind of what overtakes the other in different reaches of the stream.
Right. I mean, at some point, if, say for example, that happened all the way down to Barrier Boulevard and you stopped at Barrier Boulevard, then the Barrier Boulevard Bridge would act as essentially an orifice control, right? It would act as a weir and not let all the water that you had moved to Barrier Boulevard move downstream. But what you'd see happen is a lot of damage happening right at Barrier Boulevard. So all that water got there faster, that cross-section. So, I mean, the answer is it does provide detention, right? It provides an area for the water to get to and spread out, which is good. But because of the slope of the channel, it's also moving the water downstream faster. And the consequence of that downstream faster movement creates a lot of impacts downstream. And that's one of the benefits of our model, is that we had the opportunity to spend a lot of time developing it on a comprehensive basis with the new data and new rainfall all the way out to Galveston Bay. Some of the previous analyses were really helpful. It had a lot of good ideas that we incorporated into our analysis. They just weren't able to go into the same amount of detail with the 1D, 2D model to predict those downstream effects in the same way.
Excellent. I'll end the Q&A comments on a super high note. Glenn Venables says, excellent study to the project team and great presentation covering a lot of material. Thank you.
And we appreciate everyone attending. We appreciate John Baumgartner and Anthony Toledo from the City of League City, as the rest of the stakeholders for funding this project and pushing the ball forward. It couldn't have happened without their efforts.
So it is now after 8 o'clock. On behalf of the study team and the panelists, I'd like to thank all the attendees who took the time to participate and listen in this evening. You may email the project team at any time and visit the study website for more information about the study, and a copy of tonight's presentation and video recording is available, of course, on the city website, as Anthony said earlier. It is now the end of the meeting, and we have reached the end of the Q&A portion, and the meeting is now concluded. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Rachel.